The music business can be a nasty affair. How many stories are there about crooked managers, bad record deals, swindling promoters? So it's refreshing every once in a while that I get to tell you about a pair of musicians who made an unbelievable deal with each other that set egos aside and focused only on the music. Today we will feature two guitarists whose stories are intertwined forever in the music that they made. But they don't have the epic backstory and long career of some of the others we've featured on this channel. This is the story of two gentlemen, rare indeed in the annals of rock, that understood each other's talents and decided to make a pact for the ages. Today we're going to take an important look at a lost sideman with some mean acoustic chops and a songwriter whose everyman voice became a signature one of the 1970s. Here's the story of Jim Croce and Maury Muehleisen. Maurice Muehleisen was born on January 14, 1949 in Trenton, New Jersey, and was the second of 8 children by Margaret and Maurice Sr. Maury's mother remembered him as a baby who was drawn to music, and she often sang and played music on the radio to soothe him. Young Maury would become quite the proficient pianist, starting lessons at age 9 and showing deep talent and commitment to music at a young age. When he was 17, he decided to turn his attention to guitar and, of course, well, he absolutely dominated that too. He began to write songs and also showed off a great singing voice as well. It seemed that Maury had the total package to compete in the crowded singer-songwriter genre that was taking over the airwaves in the late 60s and early 70s. Maury would meet a professor at his college in Glassboro, New Jersey, named Joe Salviolo. Professor Salviolo put together a show called Folk Music and Related Forms, and Maury performed an original song at the show. Salviolo was impressed by Maury's work and asked Maury if he could make a tape and send it to an old college friend who was working as a record producer in New York named Tommy West. Maury would make a tape of several songs for West, and by September of 1969, he had signed him to a deal with his company, Blending Well Music. A short time after, Maury would begin recording demos of his work in New York, preparing to record his first album with West, and a proud Professor Salviolo would actually quit his job with the university to become Maury's full-time manager. Towards the end of the summer in 1970, Maury's first album, to be called Gingerbread with 2 Ds, was all but completed, and now the attention would turn to promotion. Maury would need a solid and experienced sideman to join him on stage and provide support on the tour. Soon, a name from the past would bring all these men together to create some of the most memorable music of the 1970s. Rewinding several years prior to Maury's exploits and new record deal, Salviolo and West were juniors at Villanova University, just outside of Philadelphia, when they met a young freshman in 1959 named Jim Croce, who was looking to join the Glee Club. A fast friendship evolved, and the 3 friends would remain close through the 1960s and join together to help produce Jim's first musical exploits on the albums Facets and Jim and Ingrid Croce, that Jim had written and recorded with his wife in 1969. Against their wishes, the second album was hurriedly released with a poor mix and was not successful. As a result, after some attempts at touring and salvaging the situation, Jim and Ingrid would become disillusioned with the music industry and move back to Pennsylvania, settling in an old farm in a small town near Downingtown called Lindell, and then finally moving back to Philadelphia, where Jim would take a job as a driver of a gravel truck for a construction company. But the music bug never fully left him, as happens with most musicians, and by the time Maury's story intersected with Croce's, Ingrid was pregnant and Jim had become more determined to follow his dream of music than ever before. So when old friends Tommy West and Joe Salviolo asked Jim to come back to New York to meet with Maury in the hopes of backing him up as a second guitarist, Jim didn't say no. Luckily for both Maury and Jim, the 2 men instantly hit it off as friends, and Jim was very impressed with Maury's work. The 2 became almost inseparable, practicing diligently to perform Maury's songs. For a time at the beginning, Jim had continued working his day job to put food on the table, but eventually the two men would continue working together constantly, and the partnership would also reinvigorate Jim Croce's songwriting muscles as well. At this point, Jim and Maury's partnership was so strong that Maury had no issue supporting Jim in his endeavors as well, and the two would make a tape of Jim's work and send it to Tommy West in March of 1970. Realizing that they may have actually two talented singer-songwriters on their hands, West and his partner Terry Cashman brought the two men together and discussed the idea of recording some of Jim's songs with Maury backing him up as well. The two men realized that it was possible that one or the other would become famous, leaving the other to be relegated to sideman. And they would talk about that later, and by way of a handshake deal, incredibly, they decided to put ego aside and help each other, whichever one of them had success. They also promised to take care of the other and their families no matter which one of them made it to stardom. Just an unheard of amount of modesty and friendship in an often cutthroat business. But Maury's tour for Gingerbread album would continue, with Jim accompanying him, while at the same time, West and Cashman were trying to secure a record deal for Jim to record a proper album as well. In September of 1971, Jim Croce's son, Adrian James, or AJ, was born nearly a month later than his due date, but with the arrival of the healthy baby boy, this cleared the way for Jim and Maury to begin recording in the late 1971 for Jim's first album, which would become You Don't Mess Around with Jim. By April the next year, West and Cashman would finally secure Jim a record deal with ABC Records in 1972. It is at this point that Maury's story becomes Jim and Maury's story, as Jim's success would come quickly upon the release of his first album with ABC, and the singles You Don't Mess Around with Jim, Operator, and Time in a Bottle would all receive significant airplay, with the last song going all the way to #1 on the Billboard charts. The Croce family moved to San Diego, California, and Jim suddenly became a darling of the evening and late-night television shows of the era, such as Dick Cavett, American Bandstand, and The Tonight Show. Despite the seemingly instant success, though, Jim's financial situation remained on a knife's edge, with most of his earnings going towards repaying his advance to record the album. But the success kept Jim moving along, with an American tour through the rest of 1972, which saw the pair playing large coffee houses, folk festivals, and college campuses. They would push out a second album titled Life and Times in July of 1973 that would cement Jim's status as a major voice in 70s music with his #1 worldwide smash, Bad Bad Leroy Brown. This would lead to a whirlwind tour in Europe, with Jim and Maury gaining rave reviews in cities such as London, Paris, Amsterdam, Monte Carlo, Zurich, and Dublin. More television appearances on Midnight Special, Helen Reddy, more trips overseas to play a great set on the Old Grey Whistle Test with new songs from Jim's upcoming third album, which they also found time to record between everything else. But life on the road did not agree with Jim Croce, and by the late summer of 1973, Jim wrote to his wife Ingrid, telling her that he missed her and his new son, and that he planned on giving up on the music business, deciding to write short stories or screenplays. But before that could happen, the tour would have to roll on. The late summer of 73 saw the entourage in the southern U.S. Croce and Maury played a show at Northwestern State University on September 20, 1973. Interestingly, the same night that saw the country transfixed to their televisions for the famous Battle of the Sexes tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. Calvin Gilbert, a Northwestern student and future journalist, remembered some details of that fateful night. Gilbert said, quote, "I saw Croce standing at the side of the stage chatting with some people, but mainly looking at his watch. In retrospect, that's evidence that he was anxious to get the hell out of there. It was the last show on that tour, and I'm sure he was ready to get back home." In fact, Jim actually had one more show in Texas, but was clearly getting burned out from life on the road. Reports from the time said that the band was actually scheduled to spend the night in Natchitoches, Louisiana, and fly to Texas the next morning, but for some reason, they were antsy to fly out early, and contacted the pilot to leave that night. Apparently, it was difficult to get a cab at that time in Louisiana, and pilot Robert Elliott had to walk and jog part of the way before finally being given a ride by local police. By the time he arrived at the airfield, he looked sweaty, beat up, and rattled. Jim, Maury, opening comedian George Stevens, agent Kenneth Cortez, and road manager Dennis Rast would board a Beechcraft E-18S aircraft, piloted by Elliott, less than an hour after the show had been completed, in the pitch black of night. There was a light fog and visibility was next to zero. As a result, Elliott didn't see the pecan tree that sat just at the end of the runway, and he clipped it, causing the plane to instantly break up and crash. No one on board the flight survived. Locals reported that the plane had broken up so forcefully that it looked like a bomb had hit it. News of Jim and Maury's death traveled quickly, and the shock would only be doubled by Jim's voice from beyond the very next day, as the first single from his third ABC album, I Got a Name, would be released as planned on the 21st of September. It made it that much harder to realize that an iconic voice, one of the most iconic, had been silenced so suddenly. Jim Croce was 30, Maury Muehleisen was only 24 years old. The National Transportation Safety Board performed an investigation, finding that the pilot, Robert Elliott, suffered from coronary disease and that his physical condition, along with the dark conditions of the night, contributed to the crash. The aforementioned letter that Jim had written to his wife didn't arrive into her hands until a week after his death. Years later, when Jim's wife Ingrid visited Natchitoches, the mayor told her, quote, "I just want you to know that we cut that damn tree down." I Got a Name would go on to reach number 2 in the album charts and spawn more success for Croce, who by anyone's metric was on the cusp of worldwide superstardom. His and Maury's legacy would be cemented with the release of a greatest hits album in 1974 called Photographs and Memories, which would go platinum and in just 14 songs and 41 minutes show the absolute lyrical mastery of Jim's story weavings and the amazing fills and guitar wizardry of the seriously underrated Maury Muehleisen. In just a few short years, Croce would find a way to save time in a bottle. And to think that all of this was born from a handshake partnership of two musicians, two men, two friends, two brothers who would put their egos aside to create some of the most approachable and melodic music of the early 70s is just astonishing in a business that is full of backstabbing and dirty deals. And it makes the senseless tragedy of a split-second plane crash that much harder to bear. In the above-mentioned letter to Ingrid above, Jim would write, quote, "Remember, it's the first 60 years that count, and I've got 30 to go. I love you."